can.
Hey, what's happening, y'all? Welcome to Story Time with Julian. This is, wow, I think I've got another frozen screen. Like, this is apparently just the way things go now. The screen just freezes and it gives me a chance to look really, really terrible while while I'm talking to y'all. So we're just going to put this up for a minute. This is episode number 87 of Story Time. And tonight we are going to be reading from a brand new book. Well, new to us. This book came out in about 2015, 2016. The book is called Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. And I'm really excited about this book. I think what led me to want to read this book tonight, and now I've got a frozen screen on this side, so my operations panel is stuck. But here we go. What led me to want to read this book tonight was in part what we experienced in Nafisa Spires Thompson's book on Tuesday. And there were elements of anime and comics and that sort of sci-fi piece of it that really kind of inspired me. There was a mention of Octavia Butler in the story. The character, for those of you all who were there, the character Brother Man said that he was inspired to write his comics, or it was said of him that he was inspired to write his comics when he first was introduced to Octavia Butler. And so it was just really kind of it was kind of a cool tie-in to the whole thing. And I got this book and I was excited about it. And I said, you know what? social justice movements. This is timely and appropriate. I'm with it. Um, I really want to dig right in because we're going to try and do three stories tonight, but I also want to read you the introduction. Now, for those of you all who are unfamiliar with the work of Octavia Butler, we've actually read a number of her pieces here on Storytime. And if you go over on YouTube, you'll be able to find some of those in our back episodes. I would that I could tell you right off the top of my head which episodes those are, but I can't because we've done 87 episodes so far, and it's hard for me to remember from week to week what we've read. We have read so many different authors, which is dope. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, one of the things that is most commonly said about Ms. Butler's work is that it was very prescient and forward thinking and somewhat prophetic. That the things that she wrote as though she knew we were coming into the times that we are coming into. And so it stands to reason that science fiction as a genre would be a place where Black people might prognosticate and might offer our thoughts and theories on what is to come. There's been a lot of conversation about what the real makeup of Afrofuturism is, because so much of what we see in Afrofuturism is Black folk writing a better world for ourselves, one that might be built on our understandings and our experiences of the world that we currently inhabit, but one that is looking forward to predicting or even laying the blueprint for, one might say, the work that we are, or the world that we are moving into or moving toward. The introduction by Walida, and I'm going to struggle with this name, but Walida Imarisha, I believe, addresses that. So before we actually get into the stories, I want to read that. Let me say real quick what's up around the room. I see that Lou homie Lou is here. What's happening? Angel Monique is in the building, as is Kamisha Umstead. Kitty Foxy is here. Thank you so much for being here. Judy Lee, I'm glad to see you. Angela Rains, good to see you. I see Gwen is here. What's happening? Kitty, as always, inviting some folks to come through. Can't thank you enough for that. Please make sure y'all do that. Matter of fact, everybody, if you can right now, would be a wonderful time to go ahead and share this link right now, the link that you're in on your page, and maybe tag a few people who you think would enjoy this. Okay, so we're going to get it started. Oh, hold up, I got a whole thing that I usually put up that I didn't do. Let's go ahead and plink, because I like y'all to see the cover. I want you to know what the book looks like so that when you are perusing your local Black bookstore and you see it, it jumps off the shelf at you like, you catch me unawares, because you want to get that book. You didn't see it coming, but now here it is. So this is it. This is Octavia's Brood, edited by Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Imarisha. And I think I made a typo on that name. It's tough when you're trying to build all your own graphics, but this is the book. So check it out. Here's the introduction. Whenever we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in speculative fiction. All organizing is science fiction. Organizers and activists dedicate their lives to creating and envisioning another world, or many other worlds. So what better venue for organizers to explore their work than science fiction stories? That is the premise behind the book you hold in your hands. In the years we have been working on this book, many folks have asked us what science fiction could possibly have to do with social justice organizing, and every time we have responded, everything. Everything. We want organizers and movement builders to be able to claim the vast space of possibility, to be birthing visionary stories. Using their everyday realities and experiences of changing the world, they can form the foundation for the fantastic and, we hope, build a future where the fantastic liberates the mundane. We titled this collection in honor of Black science fiction writer Octavia E. Butler. Butler explored the intersections of identity and imagination, the gray areas of race, class, gender, sexuality, love, militarism, inequality, oppression, resistance, and most importantly, hope. Her work has taught us so much about the principles of visionary fiction, inspiring us. The title plays on Butler's 3-novel collection, Lilith's Brood, which is about the adaptation as a necessity for survival. Changes will occur that we cannot even begin to imagine, and the next generation will both be utterly familiar and wholly alien to their parents. We believe this is what it means to carry on Butler's legacy of writing visionary fiction. Visionary fiction is a term we developed to distinguish science fiction that has relevance toward building new, freer worlds from the mainstream strain of science fiction, which most often reinforces dominant narratives of power. Visionary fiction encompasses all of the fantastic, with the arc always bending toward justice. We believe this space is vital for any process of decolonization because the decolonization of the imagination is the most dangerous and subversive form there is, for it is where all other forms of decolonization are born. Once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is limitless. This anthology of visionary fiction contains short stories from people who have dedicated their lives to making change. It also includes pieces from well-known science fiction writers Tananarive Due, Terry Bison, LeVar Burton, LeVar Burton, and Kalamayu Ya Salam, and from award-winning journalist and political prisoner Mamiya Abu Jamal, who writes here about Star Wars and imperialism. The process for creating this anthology was unlike any either of us editors had been involved with before, one that was very intensive and highly collaborative. We worked with contributors over the course of many rounds of edits to pull out the visionary aspects of their incredible stories, as well as to ensure that the writing and the storytelling captivated and inspired. We appreciate immensely the countless hours each writer poured into this creation of love, and we feel both lucky beyond words, that we had the support and advice of the incredible Cherie Renee Thomas, who edited the groundbreaking anthology Dark Matter: 100 Years of Speculative Fiction from the African Diaspora, which we also have on the Storytime shelf, by the way, coming up soon. Many of the contributors to Octavia's Brood had never written fiction before, let alone science fiction. When we approached folks, most were hesitant to commit, feeling like they weren't qualified. But overwhelmingly, they all came back a few weeks later enthusiastically with incredible ideas, and some with dozens of pages already written. Because all organizing is science fiction, we are dreaming new worlds every time we think about the changes we want to make in the world. The writers in this collection just needed a little space, and perhaps permission, to immerse themselves fully in their visionary selves. We especially wanted to make space for people whose identities are marginalized and oppressed within mainstream society. Art and culture themselves are time-traveling planes of existence where the past, present, and future shift seamlessly in and out. And for those of us from communities with historic collective trauma, we must understand that each of us is already science fiction walking around on two legs. Our ancestors dreamed us up and then bent reality to create us. For Adrienne and myself, as two Black women, we think of our ancestors in chains, dreaming about a day when their children's children's children would be free. They had no reason to believe this was likely, but together they dreamed of freedom, and they brought us into being. We are responsible for interpreting their regrets and realizing their imaginings. We wish to continue the work of moving forward with their visionary legacy. At a retreat for women writers in 1988, Octavia E. Butler said that she never wanted the title of being the solitary Black female sci-fi writer. She wanted to be one of many Black female sci-fi writers. She wanted to be one of thousands of folks writing themselves into the present and into the future. We believe that in that right, Butler claimed for each of us the right to dream as ourselves, individually and collectively. But we also think it is a responsibility she handed down. Are we brave enough to imagine beyond the boundaries of the real and then do the hard work of sculpting reality from our dreams? And that was the introduction. So I hope that that gives you a sense and a flavor for the story that we are about to read, for the stories that we are about to read. And without much more ado, let's go on ahead and get to it. Pardon me for just a second. You know how I do. I gotta take care of the instrument. All right. Um, just as a heads up, we read Octavia Butler in episodes 34, 37, 44, and 58. So, yeah, if you can find those on the YouTubes, they're there. And thank you so much for pointing that out, Tauntaun. We appreciate it. This first story is the one that I talked about in the pre-read, at the end of the pre-read. This is Revolution Shuffle by Bao Phi. She got to the top of the high hill first. She sat in the grass, dropping her pack down beside her, and drummed her fingers on the machine pistol holstered at her hip. As he caught up and stood beside her, she looked up, cocking her head, and flashed a crooked grin. The moon was out, lighting wispy bare clouds in the sky. Old man hair clouds, she quipped. After a moment of silence, she asked him, "What do you miss right now?" This game again. "A messy plate of nachos," he said with a sigh. "You?" "Pho," she replied, pronouncing it the way only a Vietnamese American whose best language skills revolved around the menu could. He heard it the way a Vietnamese American who understood Vietnamese best when it was coming from his parents would. He smiled. Pho was always her answer. "How about that lady with the shack out by that camp?" he asked softly, craning his neck, peering up at the stars. "You remember that camp just outside the remains of Kansas City?" She let out a dismissive puff of air through her lips. "Dingy beef water and spaghetti noodles do not pho make, buddy," she laughed. "You of all people should feel me on that one." "Certainly wasn't as good as my mom's, that's for sure," he deadpanned. She laughed loud and sudden, her smile cornering deep into her cheeks. They were about the same height and roughly the same age, so most assumed that they were brother and sister, though they could not look any more different. While both had black hair, hers cascaded down her back, a river in the dark. His was ragged and short like a burnt field. Her small, long eyes slanted like two dark swans, beaks dipping in to kiss above her nose. His eyes were deep, difficult. She was beautiful, magnetic, even if she did not want to be. His appearance was forgettable at best, for better or for worse. He was always in the background. In the distance, the rough silhouettes of 9 giant metal pistons rose into the night sky, temporarily blotting out their view of the moon and stars. The hydraulic arms lifting the pistons repetitively jackknifed and then stretched with a low, bellowing groan. The drums of steel hung suspended in the air for a moment, like the hammers of gods poised to strike, then dropped dully to the earth, thumping the ground. The noise and the impact felt and heard for miles. Though they were used to tremors from the machinery, the two companions started slightly, and looked down at the hill, at the prison camp, surrounding the giant, ground-shaking devices. The dim light emanating from the interior complex barely illuminated the pacing guards and nesting snipers on top of the walls. The guards' heads constantly turned on their necks as the guards vigilantly watched the two populations, one on either side of the barbed wire and thick concrete. On one side were throngs of shuffling zombies, attracted to the sound of the giant pistons, groaning lifelessly against the slanting thick concrete base of the wall. And inside the work camp were the Asian Americans and Arabs, forcibly interned there. Officially, the incarcerated were doing a service for their country by maintaining the rhythmic dance of the giant pistons, keeping them fueled, repairing them, as the sound and impact of the giant tramping devices lured the shambling, hungry masses. Less officially, the smell of the inmates' flesh, tantalizing out of reach, and of the zombies on the other side of the wall, kept the undead there, fresh meat outside of the lion's cage. Zombies, brown people. On any given day, the armed guards were prepared to shoot either. He looked over and saw that she closed her eyes and leaned her head slightly back. She smiled softly, every breath full and deep. She felt the night air on her, pretending she was somewhere else in some other time. She often did this before she did something reckless. Her hope was that, if she died, her soul will travel to the last beautiful place she imagined. He never asked her what her soul's place looked like. It was none of his business. She opened her eyes and sighed, then smiled at him. She pulled off her boots, took a moment to curl her toes in the grass. I see you chose red, he remarked, looking at her toenails. It was one of the small things she did to feel normal, her tiny way to hang on to what she used to be, to what used to be, before the world around her went to shit. She nodded, smiling. I did them myself this time, she said, looking down at the grass between her toes. You didn't let me do it? He asked dryly. You took a job away from a fellow Vietnamese person? She smirked and reached into her bag. She sat cross-legged in the grass and began to load bullets into the spare magazines for her AK-47. He noticed one or two zombies at the bottom of the hill, slowly shambling in their direction, lured away from the thumping pistons of the tramping machines and the smell of mass-incarcerated human flesh. Without taking his eyes from them, he rolled his G36 carbine off his shoulder and twirled the silencer onto the muzzle, slightly berating himself for not having done that earlier. Bad television, she said suddenly with a nod, biting her lip slightly. I miss bad television. He readied his rifle and looked through the scope for the wandering zombies. I miss reading trashy magazines at the dentist office, he said. The zombie that was ambling closest to them was wearing a dirty trucker's cap. He put trucker cap zombie in his crosshairs. Think they caught a whiff of us? She asked, not looking up, still clacking bullets into a mag. Shouldn't have, he answered. We're downwind. She nodded. Her eyes darted up and tracked trucker cap, watching it shamble. Her fingers didn't miss a beat, still loading bullets. The zombies did not seem to head deliberately toward the two of them, but he kept his scope on them just in case. She looked over at him and contemplated him quietly. Her best friend. They had only known each other for 5 months. 5 months in this new America seemed like an eternity. You sure you want to go down there with me? She asked quietly. He did not take his sights from The Walking Dead, nor did he reply. She gave a resigned smile in his general direction, shrugged her shoulders, and reached for another empty magazine. She watched her own fingers as they plucked the long, pointy 7.62 millimeter cartridges from her pack and methodically stabbed them down into the clip. One of these days, I'm going to get both of us killed, she quipped. Better than being locked up in a prison camp like a fucking sardine, he answered softly. When the epidemic hit America, everyone had a theory about who started it. 70% of the American population eventually turned zombie, and those who didn't had to blame someone. Because many of the people who were taken by the wasting disease happened to be white, God was not a viable culprit. The field was wide open for the survivors in America to pick a suspect, a villain, an origin for this nameless evil, and so the government classified it as a terrorist act without evidence, without even an idea of what caused it. And the American people duly picked the enemy to be vilified: China, North Korea, and the nebulous, ever-shifting region known as the Middle East. After what was left of the U.S. government and civilization regrouped on the East Coast, they started to construct the giant devices that shook the earth. They built fortified complexes in the middle of America to house the machinery. The noise and the force of the giant pistons drew the throngs of zombies to the isolated machines away from the coasts, giving the majority of survivors precious time to regroup. However, the complexes needed humans to operate and maintain the great machines, a job no one wanted. It was like living under house arrest in a log cabin, continuously surrounded by rabid wolves. Eventually, some enterprising politicians suggested that surviving Americans of Asian and Arab descent be interned as laborers in these camps, an idea that caught on as quickly as the plague itself. For their own protection, the politicians insisted. Hordes of survivors had formed lynch mobs after the disease was classified as a terrorist act, attacking and brutalizing yellow and brown people. There were not enough police to protect them, not enough infrastructure left to respond to these racialized violence, so the politicians said. Instead, they argued that it would be in the best interest of the targeted communities to be guarded in these work camps away from the other survivors. No one explained how herding up Asian and Arab Americans based on the color of their skin, seizing their property, and then forcibly incarcerating them without trial in work camps could be in their best interest. But then again, history had shown conclusively that the American public didn't need a complicated explanation as much as they needed a clear enemy to blame. Tragic times do not beg for complexity. After the emergency legislation was passed, police and military deputized armed civilians and new private military contractors began rounding up and transporting Asian Americans, Arab Americans, and any person in that particular color spectrum into their new work camps. It didn't matter if a person actually had ancestry from North Korea, China, or the Middle East. It became all too apparent that was not the point. There were Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, Chicanos, and Black people thrown into the camps for protesting, for daring to raise their voices in opposition, for choosing the wrong side. Close enough. And thus, people learned not to speak out against the camps. In the wake of disaster, America became even less subtle. Less than 2 years ago, the camps like the one below them were not even finished. Now this one sat thumping and belching smoke, crawling with the undead outside and living entombed within. She finished loading her last spare clip and dropped her hands down to the grass, looking down at the internment complex, listening to the pistons groan as they began their upward arc into the night sky. She remembered those early days. One man and his battered, dirty driver's license. He had struggled against the officers at first, desperate and terrified. One of his wild swings hit a police officer on the side of the head, making the cop's cap fall off his sweaty blonde hair. Seeing the cop enraged, the man wept, dropped to his knees, pulled out his wallet, held up his ID like a shield. He apologized, crying, saying he was scared, he had a family. He swore he was Indian, not Arab. She was sure they believed him. They shot him anyway. His driver's license flipped face down into the dirt next to his body. You know, even if we succeed, some of them aren't going to want to come with us, he murmured, finally letting his rifle rest against his shoulders as Trucker Cap shambled off in another random direction away from them. I know, she replied, pulling on her boots and standing up slowly. You're getting 3 square meals a day and you're living in a camp protected from zombies by the U.S. military, he sighed. Armed private militarized contractors, she corrected him, cocking an eyebrow at him. They both knew how dismal life was in the camps. The cramped, stifled quarters, the lousy food, 16-hour shifts, how everything smelled like oil and hot metal. The flat screen mounted on the wall in the cafeteria would sometimes broadcast a message from out east, declaring how important their work maintaining the pistons was, as if they had a choice. The shadows of men with guns always long on the floor. How hard was it to sleep with the constant drone of zombies hungry for you? How you could almost feel the tips of their rotting fingers digging into your flesh at all times. How turning down the sexual advances of a guard could get you thrown off the wall. How easy they made it to betray one another, even in there. Try as she might, she couldn't blame the prisoners. She had met a couple of activists who could not understand why the incarcerated were so, to their eyes, submissive, obedient. But she knew that the truth was complicated. If not the camps, where could they go? A week ago, many miles from where they stood, they had sat at a campfire splitting a cup of instant ramen with some strips of beef jerky thrown in. White trash pho, they called it. This was when she told him her plan. The light of the fire flickered in the canopy of trees above as she watched him carefully to see his reaction. For the ones that follow us, where do we take them? He asked quietly. Alaska? She laughed at the mention of the largest American territory completely free of the epidemic, because it had the good fortune of being far enough away when the epidemic hit the shore to shore up its defenses before it got to them. We'd have better odds of creating a time machine and going back to prevent all this from happening. Hawaii? He asked. No way they'd let us in. We're like dogs with rabies to them. He paused. Before he could continue, she shook her head, looking into the distance with a slight smile, as if she was trying to visualize a place for them in the world. East Coast? No way. They might be the most racially mixed region left, but a group of Asians and Arabs walking out of the middle? They'd shoot us before we get within sight of that ridiculous wall of theirs, or ship us back to one of these prison camps. I don't want to get into that fight between Mexico and the new nation state of Texas in the south. Southwest is New Atzlan and other United Native folks, and they've got their hands full of shoring up against raiders and zombies. She paused for a moment. Maybe they'd let in one or two of us, but an entire group of Asian and Arab refugees recently busted out of federal labor camp, they'd probably get threatened with drone bombing for agreeing to help any of us. She chuckled and shook her head sadly, biting her lip, her eyes distant as she continued. And the north, where all the white hunters and survivalists have dug in, deer have got a better chance of going into those woods and surviving than we do. Don't mess with Wisconsin, he quipped. He waited for a moment, then asked, how about back to the homeland, somewhere in Asia? She laughed long and hard. He turned his head back to see that she had been watching him silently, contemplating him. She often did not have to hear words to know what a person was thinking. Intuition was her gift. No, buddy, she winked. It's right in the middle of the box for our people, or nothing. The middle of America, infested with zombies, ruled by small warlords and thug fiefdoms. Many of them made up the remains of the Minutemen and other batshit crazy racist militias. The most dangerous place in the world, the place no one wanted to be. And it's just one camp, he said. The first one, she corrected with a slight nod and a smile. He looked over at her, shaking his head slowly in bemused disbelief. As the days got more grim, she somehow grew stronger, as if she lived to be the opposite of the dim future that seemed all but certain. He turned to look back down at the camp, pondering their chances. How many more camps are there just like that one? We can't save everyone. Doesn't mean we can't try, she countered. She waited a moment, crossing her arms in front of her in the slightly chill night air, before reminding him, you don't have to go with me. You wouldn't be much of a leader if you didn't have at least one follower, he smirked. And she laughed her unbreakable laugh, shaking her head. Her smile broke clear across her face. Her smile had become his horizon, but he did not say this out loud. He turned and looked her solemnly in the eyes. Is it too much to ask for a happy ending? She smiled sadly. I don't think there are any happy endings left. After a moment, she said, I miss hotel rooms. I used to love to travel, before all of this. Sure, hotel rooms were never yours, but I loved that you came back to a place that wasn't yours and someone made the bed for you. She shook her head, then smiled her radiant, breathtakingly beautiful smile for him. It got even wider when she saw his rare, small smile finally break across his face, a hairline fracture on an egg. She put a hand on his shoulder and they stood in silence for a moment, the giant piston's blocky silhouette swallowing them from the moon's light, their bodies becoming one with the shadow before thumping down to the earth once again. Then they strode down the hill together, rifles in hand, straight for the prison camp, toward a war that just might turn into something like a revolution. And thus endeth the story. All right, y'all. So I see that the comments were pretty much limited to just the beginning of the story. So I don't know if the silence is because y'all were really digging it, or if the silence was because y'all were rolling your eyes. I can't tell. But I see that Gwen picked up on that line. Because they were white, God was not a viable culprit. Saw that one too. That was definitely a statement. And it seems like there was a little side conversation about the pho. I am glad that we read this story. I know that it breaks with story time with Julian tradition because we typically only read stories by Black authors, and that is the position and the theme of this show. I wanted to read this story once I discovered that it was written by an Asian American author, in part because of the the tragedy, the devastation that's happened in Atlanta, and the conversation that's going on surrounding it. For those of you all who were present for the pre-read, you heard my impassioned tirade, I guess, about making sure that we keep the focus of the conversation on dismantling white supremacy. So it was important to me to see how an Asian American author would treat the issues of social justice and revolution in a science fiction story. And I have a lot of thoughts on this that I haven't yet quite put together, but definitely, I think an interesting story, really, really well written, a little bit scary how close it is to the times, how easily legislation like that could be passed, particularly given the current cultural climate. This sort of random legislator who who in this story recommended, for their own well-being, for their safety, we need to put the Asian Americans and the Arabs all in these camps because it would be best for them, and pushed that emergency legislation through. You think that's not possible? Hmm? You think Josh Hawley wouldn't come up with something like that and try and run that through? Or Marjorie, whatever, the super crazy one, you think they wouldn't run that through? Y'all know that I get real chest thumpy about participating in elections. This is why. Every position matters. Every position matters. Anyway, there's so much more about this story. I want to see your comments. Would love to hear your thoughts. If not now, then later on in the program. But we're going to move into the second story here. And I'm a little excited about this one because the title of this story is The Token Superhero. And this one is excuse me. This one is by David F. Walker. You know what? I forgot to do this for the last story. I'm not going to forget to do it this way. Let me go ahead and put that up. So for those of you all who are interested, you can remember the name of the story, yada, yada, yada. Y'all get what we do. Um, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the time because we are running a little short of time. And I thought these stories would read a little bit faster, but they're a little denser than I thought. But before we move into this story, I do want to remind you, if you have the opportunity, if you have been blessed, if Wednesday was a particularly good morning for you and you woke up $1,400 richer and you'd like to do something good, I encourage you to please donate to our book drive, the Storytime with Julian. First annual spring book drive is still going on. And from your mobile device, you can use Venmo or Cash App to hit up Harriet's Bookshop. They are our partners in this book drive. We are really excited. The last time I spoke with you on Tuesday, we were about $500 away. I believe we are within $100 now of meeting our complete goal, and any surplus that there is will go to giving more books to more kids. So we're really, really excited to close in on that goal, and we are running out of time. I mean, the drive ends on the 24th. Books are already being shipped out. If you or someone you love participated and nominated a child and you've gotten your books already, do me a solid if you would and snap a picture and send it to us here at Storytime so that we can put some of those up. It would do my heart good just to see the kids happy with their new Black authored books. It would mean the world to me, and I think a lot of viewers would appreciate seeing that as well. All right, so that's that. The information was there at the scroll, and of course you can visit the page and find that information again. And that being said, I'm going to take a little sip of water and we're going to move into the token superhero. Alonzo Ramey was born to be a superhero. At the time of his birth, he tested positive for Kurtzberg 24 syndrome, the genetic anomaly responsible for giving superpowers to people. All babies with K24 were identified and monitored, with cautious eyes keeping track of the powers that developed. The vast majority of K24 kids developed a power set that usually included superhuman strength, endurance, speed, and bulletproof skin. The standards is what such powers were called by the doctors and experts who tracked such things. Some of the kids developed unique powers, anything from pyrotelekinesis to the ability to breathe underwater. Alonzo's parents prayed that his powers would be limited to the standards. With the standards, there was always a chance of having a life that could at least pass for being normal. The more unusual the powers, however, the more difficult life could become. With some powers, there simply wasn't any chance of leading a normal life. Everyone knew about the Flamer, who could make fire but couldn't control it. The Flamer had to walk around in a specially designed suit to keep from burning everything and everyone around him with to keep from burning everything and everyone around him whenever fire would randomly shoot from his body. And then there was Elasticine, who could stretch her body like it was made out of rubber, but it took days to return to its original shape. Them white folk ain't gonna take too kindly to a colored boy with superpowers, said Kelvin Ramey, Alonzo's father. Kelvin had grown up in rural Mississippi, back when being black meant a second-class life. Alonzo was born into a better world after marching and the demonstrations and the water hoses and police dogs, but his father remembered it all, and he worried for his son. They'd killed Martin, Malcolm, and Medgar and so many others, and none of them even had any superpowers. There was no telling what might happen to Alonzo if some crazed redneck decided a superpowered Negro was a threat to the possibility of the South rising up. That was, after all, what every Southern redneck claimed was going to happen. Time and time again, the South had failed to rise again, but the fear and hatred of black people remained. And it wasn't just the South. Black people were feared and hated all over the country, and where they weren't feared or hated, they were misunderstood. Fortunately, Alonzo being born with K24 syndrome meant a ticket out of Mississippi for his parents and his older sister. Some clinic up north, the Kurtzberg Metahuman Research and Training Center, wanted to test Alonzo regularly, and as his powers manifested, they wanted to make sure he'd get the proper training. Proper training, of course, meant that he'd be trained to use his powers to fight for truth, justice, and all that other stuff they talked about in the comic books, movies, and television shows that recounted the adventures of superheroes and crime fighters. By the time Alonzo turned 16, his powers had fully developed. Much to the delight of his father, Alonzo only had the standards, although his strength levels tested right up there with some of the strongest superheroes. Kelvin Ramey's relief that his son only had the standards was short-lived, however, when Alonzo was asked to join the newly formed Teen Justice Force, which was started by the Super Justice Force in a stroke of marketing genius to appeal to the younger crowd. Superheroes in their 20s and 30s were popular, but tended to trend low with teenagers. It all had to do with hostility toward adults. Older superheroes made teenagers think of their parents and teachers. Teen Justice Force was created to bridge the gap between the younger demographic and the crucial adult demo. To make sure the valuable customers didn't lose interest in Super Justice Force, their exploits, or, most important, the multi-billion-dollar entertainment industry that kept the entire operation running. I don't know how I feel about you joining this Kitty Justice Force outfit, Kelvin Ramey told his son. They're called Teen Justice Force and not Kitty Justice Force, said Alonzo. Teen, Kitty, it's all the same. You're too young to be running around playing being a superhero. I'm not playing, Dad. I am a superhero, said Alonzo, and these powers that I have are a gift. It's my responsibility to use them to help my fellow man. See, I told your mother they brainwashed you, Kelvin said. He'd been convinced that his son would be turned into a pawn of the man, even though he couldn't actually identify the man or his agenda. I'm not brainwashed. I'm thinking for myself, just like you and Mom taught me to do. The conversation went on like that, but in the end, Kelvin knew his son was going to be a superhero, and nothing could stop it happening. He wanted to be angry, but his wife, Vonsetta, the pragmatic one in the family, helped calm him down. Daddy K, are you really going to be angry that our son was blessed with wings and has decided to use them to fly? She asked. Even though Vonsetta calmed him down, Kelvin could not bring himself to sign the parental release form required for Alonzo to join Teen Justice Force. Instead, Vonsetta signed the release. It's not that your daddy doesn't want you to be a superhero. It's just that he worries about you, said Vonsetta. You know that, son. Yes, ma'am, said Alonzo. With the written consent of his mother, Alonzo Ramey became one of the first members of Teen Justice Force and the only member of color, unless you counted Neptuna, who had bluish skin and could breathe underwater. Neptuna had been given a terrible name. When it became the object of public ridicule, it was quickly changed. Alonzo didn't have the same luck. He'd been given the superhero name Black Fist, which made absolutely no sense to him. It wasn't like he had unusually large fists or fists made of anvils like the supervillain Anvil Fist, or that his powers were solely based in his fist. No, he was stuck with the name Black Fist because when push came to shove, no one wanted to think that hard when it came time to name the token black guy on Teen Justice Force. Alonzo's career in Teen Justice Force was perfectly fine, although he was the only member without his own solo comic book or an endorsement deal. Even Neptuna got some choice deals, although these came after her name was changed to Princess Oceana. And when Teen Justice Force animated series proved popular enough to see a line of action figures produced, the only member not to have a figure made was Black Fist. If it had been just a case of not having his own comic, action figure, or endorsement deals, the degradation of being a black superhero with black in his name might have been bearable. But all of that stuff was minor compared to the fact that neither Black Fist nor his alter ego got much respect from the press. In private, Black Fist was pretty much the leader of Teen Justice Force. In a fight, the other members all turned to him for decisions, and on multiple occasions he'd saved each of them from certain death. But every article about the Force's exploits always seemed to downplay his involvement, saying Black Fist was also present, if he was even mentioned at all. Things didn't get better when Alonzo aged out of Teen Justice Force, which is when Captain Freedom, the leader of the Super Justice Force, offered him a position on the team. But at the age of 20, Alonzo was already bitter, cynical, and tired of being a token. He tried to reinvent himself with a new costume and a new name, but none of it took. Twice he'd been attacked by other superheroes who'd mistaken him for a supervillain, and then there was that time he'd been shot by cops. Fortunately, the bullets had bounced off. Disgusted and depressed, Alonzo Ramey decided to retire from the superhero business. Despite his original misgivings, no one was more disappointed by the retirement of Black Fist than Kelvin Ramey. He had come to see that his son was a great superhero. In the barbershop where Kelvin worked, the exploits of Black Fist were a regular topic of conversation, along with relevant issues such as police brutality in the community, gentrification, and how music was so much better back in the day. The autographed picture of Black Fist hanging on the wall at the shop got more comments than the photos of famous rappers and athletes. "You sure you won't do this?" Kelvin asked his son. "I thought you of all people would be happy to see me give it up," Alonzo said. "I just want to make sure you're giving it up for the right reasons," Kelvin said. He took great care not to explain what the right reasons were, because he knew that it was something only Alonzo could determine for himself. So Black Fist officially retired, and Alonzo tried to adjust to his new life, but it wasn't easy. He got a regular job and enrolled in college with no plans other than leading a normal life. After a few months, however, he started missing the action and excitement of being a superhero, even when it came with little respect or acknowledgement. And one day, while riding the subway home from his boring job in the non-superhero world, he saw something that changed his life. A group of rowdy teens, not much younger than Alonzo, had been terrorizing passengers on the train headed uptown. His years as a superhero kicked in, and Alonzo started to intervene, but before he could, another group of teens entered the subway car. These kids, a motley crew of 3 boys and 2 girls of various backgrounds, rushed the rowdy teens. For a moment, it looked like things would turn violent. The punks who had been terrorizing the other passengers were bigger, but the other kids stood their ground. And after a few heated words laced with profanity, the confrontation ended. That's when Alonzo noticed that the kids who stood up to the punks were all wearing t-shirts with an image of Black Fist. In all his time as Black Fist, there had never been any officially licensed merchandise, no t-shirts, pajamas, anything like that. "Excuse me," Alonzo said to the group of teenagers. "Where'd you get those shirts?" "We made them," said one of the girls. She flashed a huge grin, revealing the braces that covered her teeth. "You made your own Black Fist t-shirts?" Alonzo asked. "Why?" All at once, the kids launched into an explanation of how Black Fist had not only been the coolest member of Teen Justice Force, but was also the coolest superhero around. He does what he does because he can do it, said one of the boys. It ain't all about the business with him. He just made me feel good about myself because, he's black and all, said the other girl. I just wish he hadn't retired, said the first girl. In that moment, it struck Alonzo Ramey that being a superhero meant more than endorsement deals, your own comic book series, and whatever fame and fortune might come your way for fighting the good fight. He had gone through years of training, been on countless missions, and saved hundreds of lives, but it wasn't until that moment on the subway that he understood what it was all about. Yes, he'd been a token black superhero in a world made up mostly of white heroes. Yes, his name was ridiculous, and he hated that it was a constant reminder that others felt he needed to state the obvious when it came to defining who he was as a hero. And yes, it sucked that he didn't get credit where credit was due, but that wasn't how those kids on the subway saw him. To them, he was simply a superhero they admired enough to make their own t-shirts emblazoned with his image. And that was enough to make Alonzo Ramey rethink everything. Shortly after that, Alonzo asked Captain Freedom about returning to Super Justice Force. He'd been apprehensive at first, recalling how his father used to say, "If you ask a white man for anything, you best be prepared to beg." But there was no begging. He didn't even have to tooth it up by putting on a fake smile, something his father told him never to do. Instead, Alonzo and Captain Freedom talked man to man. "There's very little about this line of work that is easy," said Captain Freedom. "If I could make the world a better place, the kind of place where you could be who you are without any of the crap that the world puts on you, then I'd do it. But in that world, there'd be no need for superheroes." And so Alonzo Ramey went back to being a superhero. He once again donned his Black Fist costume and took to the streets fighting crime. But this time around, he changed his personal definition of what it meant to be a superhero. Yes, he still spent his time slugging it out with super criminals and engaging in what amounted to a ridiculous carnival sideshow, but that was all only part of what he did. Instead of patrolling the streets of the inner city and busting gangbangers, he spent much of his time reaching out to the youth that most people saw as a threat. He became known as much for being a community organizer superhero as he did for being a superhero. With the money from his first real endorsement deal, he bankrolled his own comic book series, which was geared toward promoting literacy. The series became so popular that it launched an entire line of comics that helped teach kids of all colors how to read. Over the years, Black Fist felt the bitterness rise up inside of him from time to time, as well as the cynicism. He hated his name, didn't care much for the costume, and when he finally got his own action figure, they made his lips look way bigger than they were in real life. But whenever these things got to him, Alonzo Ramey remembered that at the end of the day, none of those things mattered. For him, his life would always be defined by a group of boys and girls no more than 14 or 15 years old, wearing t-shirts with hand-drawn designs inspired by Black Fist. His life would not be defined as much by his adventures as by the adventures recounted in the comic books that helped young people learn to read. And that's what defined Alonzo Ramey. That's what let him know that despite it all, he really was a superhero. And thus endeth the story. All right, y'all. So that was The Token Superhero by David F. Walker. I got to say, if any of you all were having flashbacks of the show The Boys, join me, because I too experienced those flashbacks. So much of what they were describing reminded me of the company Vault and just the overall premise of that show, the monetization and capitalization of heroism, and the very clear underlying white supremacy that is there to prop that heroism up. So I definitely thought about that show while I was reading this show. This particular story was, for me, a little bit had a little bit of saccharine aftertaste, but I liked it overall. And I think that definitely just that speaks largely to my love for comic books and the superhero and comic book genre, and the idea of, how would one exist? How would you manage life with superhero powers in a world that already was set up to identify, train, capitalize on and steer those powers in a certain direction. I think if I don't know, like real talk, if I was born with powers, or if I found myself with powers, I would definitely not let it be known. Either that, or I would be so big and loud about it that you're gonna have to take me out very, very publicly. Um, but I can't see myself suborning to a system that is trying to steer my powers in a particular direction. Um, that being said, everybody here under the sound of my voice, you have a superpower. You know what it is. You know you do. Maybe we should think about whether or not we are already in a system that suborns our superpowers to steer them in a particular direction so as to not have them get in the way of the fight against white supremacy. It's a running theme. Running theme. Let me look at some of y'all's comments. At least this, I think this one did a lot, brought a lot out of you. So that makes me really happy. I see that. Let's see. Saniqua says no superpowers, that can be argued. Angela Lee pulled out the line, these powers that I have are a gift. Listen, everybody who is watching this show right now, you ought to be saying that to yourselves every day. Identify what your superpower is and recognize that these powers that you have are a gift. You feel me what I'm saying to you? It's just that he worries about you, says every black mama in the entire world. Yeah, that line, it felt almost cliche, which was troubling, but yeah, I was with it. I was with it. And so was Saniqua. So when it benefited him, Kelvin was down for it. You know what? I don't know if it was so much that it was when it benefited him as it was he needed to see it. I think Kelvin's cynicism toward the world at large had it difficult for him to see how his son could be okay, how his son could thrive in that environment and wouldn't be used, maybe even used up, maybe even used to death. I think for me, that's how I saw Kelvin's sort of turn as he came around to Alonzo's situation. No marketing of figures like they did with Black Panther. No, Black Panther got some toys. Black Panther actually had a whole lot of toys, and the marketing for Black Panther in the States was pretty fucking good, considering the fact that they just didn't have any idea that it was going to be $1 billion movie. They didn't downplay it the way that I thought about it. I think they marketed about the same way they did as Guardians of the Galaxy, the first one. So I was okay with that. But what I hated was the way that they treated Black Panther overseas, how they made sure to cover up Chadwick Boseman's face, and how the action figures that were produced overseas were just straight up stereotypical. There's no other way to put it. Tooth it up. I caught that too. I like that too. That was definitely one of those little standout lines. I see a lot of you all. Well, good. I'm glad that you love the story. Gwen said it was cute, and I see a lot of you all were right there with me about the boys, and so that's cool. That's cool. Yeah, yo, the ending. We're not even gonna talk about it, but yeah, the ending of the last season, the boys was trash. I don't know if I see Alonzo as A-Train, but nah, okay. I don't like A-Train well enough, and I actually kind of liked Alonzo, but yeah, the tokenism that represented A-Train, definitely see that. Tony says it felt like our boy Black Fist was still settling for scraps. Agreed. What I did like about that was, though, that he made his own line of comics. He didn't wait on them to make a comic about him, and that line of comics represented who he was and what he was about. That spoke to me a lot, actually. Son was blessed with wings and decided to use them to fly was one of my favorite lines. That was a dope line. That was a super dope line, actually. And Gwen says, global anti-blackness. Yep. Yep, indeed. Yo, I'm so glad that y'all are all still here sticking with me. I think because it's 11:02, I think we're going to run a little bit long. But if you're still with it and you're still sitting with me, I want to read this final story, which is called The River. And this story was actually written by one of the editors of the book. Let me know. Give me y'all's approval. I mean, I'm probably going to do what I'm going to do anyway, but I just want to make sure that y'all are down for it and y'all are with it. So let me see something. And while we're paused again, let me remind you again, please, if you can, I believe we are just about $100 away from our goal. So anybody who could donate $5, $10 right now using Venmo or Cash App to Harriet's Bookshop, and the information is there. If you could do that, and use the hashtag STWJ Spring. I would love for us to meet. I'd love for us to exceed our goal, because if we exceed our goal, more kids get more books. But I would love to make sure that we meet our goal of $2,000. And we are just about there. So please, if you can, go ahead and do that. And also just want to remind you, if you are so inclined, if you were blessed on Wednesday and you want to bless this program, we'd love it if you did. We do this for free and out of goodness and just because we love this work that we do. But it would absolutely bless us if you decided to bless us a little bit and tip your griot. You can use $ Storytime with Julian. It would absolutely mean a lot. Every dollar that goes into Storytime with Julian, every dollar that's donated to Storytime with Julian goes into Storytime with Julian. Let me know in the comments in general so far. Are you all loving this? Are you all loving this book? Because I'm loving this book. And if y'all are really loving this book, you should go and pick it up. You can find the Octavia's Brood at Harriet's Bookshop, and the link is right here. So for those of you who are watching us, for those of you who are watching us on Facebook, you can go ahead and click the link there. Otherwise, you can follow it. Just go to bookshop.org/books. You know what? It's long, but look for Harriet's Bookshop and go on and find this book and get this book for yourself. I don't believe you will regret it. I mean, when I was reading the intro, LeVar Burton got a story in here. You know, I have to go super meta and at some point read LeVar Burton's story. Like, I have to. It has to happen. Tauntaun asks, is magical black a superpower? Black girl magic and black boy joy. I think when you consider the amount of oppression that it takes to overcome, or I'm sorry, the amount of power that it takes to overcome the oppression that is the day-to-day of being black in this country, yes, magical blackness is indeed a superpower. And I see that some of y'all are down for it, so let's go ahead and get this last story out while we can. Thank you so much for coming by. And I do want to let everybody know who is in the after story. We will be doing an after story discussion, so make sure that you stay tuned for that room to open up. All right, let's go. The River, Part 1. Something in the river haunted the island between the city and the border. She felt it. When she was on the waves in the little boat, she didn't say anything because what could be said, and to whom? But she felt it, and she felt it growing. Made a sort of sense to her that something would grow there. Enough things went in for something to have created itself down there. She was a water woman, had learned to boat as she learned to walk, and felt rooted in the river. She learned from her grandfather, who told her his life lessons on a big, spacious place under a great big sky. This little country here, we have to fight for any inches we get. But the water has always helped us get free one way or another. Sunny days she took paying passengers over by the Belle Isle Bridge to see cars in the water. Mostly you couldn't see anything, but sometimes you'd catch a glimpse of something shiny, metal, not of the river. Something big and swallowed that had a color of cherry red, of 1964 American-made dream. These days, the river felt like it had back then, a little too swollen, too active, too attentive. Too many days she sat behind the wheel of the little boat, dialing down her apprehension. She felt a restlessness in the woods and the shadows that held Detroit together. Belle Isle, an overgrown island, housed in the ruins of a zoo, an aquarium, a conservatory, and the old yacht club down the way were the abandoned, squatted towers of the Renaissance Center, the tallest ode to economic crisis in the world. She had been born not too far from the river, in Chalmers on the east side. As a child, she played along the river banks. She could remember when a black person could only dock a boat at the one black-owned harbor. She remembered it because all she'd ever wanted was to be on that river, especially after her grandfather passed. When she was old enough, she'd purchased the little boat, motor awkward on its backside, and named her Bessie after her mama. Her mama had taught her the important things, how to love Detroit, that gardening in their backyard was not a hobby, but a strategy, and to never trust a man for the long haul. Mostly she'd listened to her mama, and when she'd gone astray, she'd always been able to return to the river. Now she was 43 and the river was freedom. In that boat, she felt liberated all day. She loved to anchor near the Underground Railroad Memorial and imagined runaway slaves standing on the bank, and how good, terrifying but good, that water must have felt under the boat, or all over the skin, or frozen under the feet. This was a good river for boating. You wouldn't jump in for any money. No one would. She felt the same way about eating out of the river, but it was a hungry time. That morning, she'd watched a fisherman reel in something slow, like he didn't care at all. What he pulled up, a long, slender fish, had an oily sheen on its scales. She tried to catch his eye with her disgust, offer a side-eye warning to the stranger, but he turned with his catch headed for the icebox. She was aware of herself as kind of an outsider. She loved the city desperately and the people in it, but she mostly loved them from her boat. She wore her overalls, kept her graying hair short and natural, her sentences brief. Her routine didn't involve too many humans. When she tried to speak, even small talk, there was so much sadness and grief in her mouth for the city disappearing before her eyes that it got hard to breathe. Next time she was out on the water, on a stretch just east of Chinna Park, she watched two babies on the rocks by the river, daring each other to get closer. The mothers were in deep and focused gossip, while also minding a grill that uttered a gorgeous smell over the river waves. The waves were moving aggressive today, and she wanted to yell to the babies or to the mamas, but she couldn't get the words together. You can't just yell any old thing in Detroit. You have to get it right. Folks remember. As she watched, one baby touched his bare toe in, his trembling, ashy mocha body stretched onto the rippling nuclear aquamarine green surface. Then suddenly he jumped up and backed away from the river, spooked in every limb. He took off running past his friend all the way to his mama's thighs, which he grabbed and buried himself in, babbling incoherent confessions to her flesh. The mother didn't skip a beat or a word, just brushed him aside, ignoring his warning. She didn't judge, though, that mama. Times were beyond tough in Detroit. A moment to pause, to vent, to sit by the river and just talk. That was a rare and precious thing. Off the river, out of the water, she found herself in an old friend's music studio, singing her prettiest sounds into his machines. He was as odd and solitary as she was, known for his madness, his intimate, marrow-deep knowledge of the city, and his musical genius. She asked him, "What's up with the river?" He laughed at first. She didn't ask why. Here is what he said. "Your river? Man, Detroit is in that river. The whole river and the parts of the river. Certain parts, it's like an ancestral burying ground. It's like a holy vortex of energy. Like past the island, in the deep shits where them bangers plow through, them barges plow through, that was the hiding place. And that's where you went if you loose-tongued about the wrong thing or the wrong people. Man, all kinds of sparkling souls been weighed down all the way in the mud in there. That's why some folk won't anchor with the city in view. Might hook someone before they ghost. Takes a while to become a proper ghost." He left it at that. She didn't agree with his theory, didn't feel dead, what she felt in the river, felt other, felt alive and other. Peak of the summer was scorched that year. The city could barely get dressed. The few people with jobs sat in icy offices watching the world waver outside. People without jobs survived in a variety of ways that all felt like punishment in the heat. Seemed like every morning there'd be bodies, folks who'd lost Darwinian struggles during the sweaty night. Bodies by the only overnight shelter, bodies in the fake downtown garden sponsored by Coca-Cola, bodies in potholes on streets strung with Christmas lights because the broke city turned off the street lights. Late one Sunday afternoon, after 3 weddings took place on the island, she heard a message come over the radio. 4 pale bodies found floating in the surrounding river on the far side. She tracked the story throughout the day. Upon being dragged out of the water and onto the soil by gloved official hands, it was clear that the bodies of 2 adults and 2 teenagers were recently dead, hardly bloated, each one bruised as if they'd been in a massive struggle before the toxic river filled their lungs. They were from Pennsylvania. On Monday, she motored past the spot she'd heard the Coast Guard going on about over the radio. The water was moving about itself, swirling without reason. She shook her head, knowing truths that couldn't be spoken aloud were getting out of hand. She tried for years to keep an open heart to the new folks, most of them white. The city needed people to live in it and job creation, right? And some of these new folks seemed to really care. But it could harden her heart a little each day to see people showing up all the time with jobs or making new work for themselves and their friends, while folk born and raised here couldn't make a living, couldn't get investors for businesses. She heard entrepreneurs on the news speak of Detroit as this exciting new blank canvas. She wondered if the new folks just couldn't see all the people there, the signs everywhere that there was history there, and there was a people still living all over that canvas. The next tragedy came Tuesday when a passel of new local hipsters were out on the island's unsecret swimming spot in an inner waterway of Belle Isle. This tragedy didn't start with screams, but that was the first thing she heard. A wild cacophony of screaming through the thick reeds. By the time she doubled back to the silver entrance of the waterway and made it to the place of the screaming sounds, there was just a whimper. Just one whimpering white kid on an island patrol, staring into the water. She called out, "What happened?" The patrol, a white kid himself, looked up, terrified and incredulous and trying to be in control. "Well, some kids were swimming out here. Now they're missing, and this one says a wave ate them." The kid turned away from the river briefly to look up at the patrol, slack-mouthed and betrayed. Then the damp, confused face turned to her and pointed toward the water. "It took them." She looked over the side of the boat, then down into the shallows and seaweed. The water and weeds moved innocently enough, but there were telltale signs of guilt. A mangled pair of aviator glasses, 3 strips of natty breadboard shorts, the black half of a navy-striped Tom's shoe, a tangle of bikini, and an unlikely pile of clean new bones of various lengths and origins. She gathered these troubled spoils with her net, clamping her mouth down against the lie. "I told you so," because who had she told? And even now, as more kinds of police and Coast Guard showed up, what was there to say? Something impossible was happening. She felt bad for those hipsters. She knew some of their kind from her favorite bars in the city and had never had a bad experience with any of them. She had taken boatloads of them on her river tours over the years. It wasn't their fault there were so many of them. Hipsters and entrepreneurs were complicated locusts. They ate up everything in sight, but they meant well. They should have shut down the island then, but these island bodies were only a small percentage of the bodies of summer, most of them stabbed, shot, strangled, stomped, starved. Authorities half-heartedly posted ambiguous warning flyers around the island as swimmers, couples strolling on the river walk paths, and riverside picnickers went missing without explanation. No one else seemed to notice that the bodies the river was taking that summer were not the bodies of Detroiters. Perhaps because it was a diverse body of people, all ages, all races, all the folk who had come more recently, drawn by the promise of empty land and easy business, the opportunity available among the ruins of other people's lives. She wasn't much on politics, but she hated the shifts in the city, the way it was fading as it filled with people who didn't know how to see it. She knew what was coming. What always came with pioneers. Strip malls and sameness. She'd seen it enough times. So even though the river was getting dangerous, she didn't take it personally. She hated strip malls too. Then something happened that got folks' attention. The mayor's house was a mansion with a massive yard and covered dock on the river, overlooking the Midwestern jungle of Belle Isle and further on, the shore of gentle Canada. This was the 3rd consecutive white mayor of the great black city, this one born in Grand Rapids, raised in New York, and appointed by the governor. He'd entered office with economic promises on his lips as usual, but so far he had just closed a few schools and added a 3rd incinerator tower to expand Detroit's growing industry as leading trash processor of North America. The mayor had to entertain at home a few times a year, and his wife's job was to orchestrate elegance using the mansion as the backdrop. People came, oohed and awed, and then left the big empty place to the couple. Based on the light patterns she observed through the windows on her evening boat rides, she suspected the two spent most of their time out of the public eye, happily withdrawn to opposite wings. She brought the boat past the yard and covered dock every time she was circling the island looking for sunset. As the summer had gone on, island disappearances had put the spook in her completely, and she circled farther and farther from the island shores, closer and closer to the city, which meant that on the evening of the mayor's August cocktail party, she was close to his yard, close enough to see it happen. Dozens of people coated the yard with false laughter, posing for cameras they each assumed were pointed in their direction. Members of the press were there, marking themselves with cameras and tablets and smartphones, with the air of journalists covering something relevant. The mayor was aiming for Dapper, a rose in his lapel. As she drifted through the water, leaving no wake, the waves started to swell erratically. In just a few moments, the water began thrashing wildly, bucking her. It deluged the front of her little boat as she tried to find an angle to cut through. Looking around, she saw no clear source of disruption, just a single line of waves moving out from the island behind her, clear as a moonbeam on a midnight sea. She doubled the boat around until she was out of the waves, marveling at how the water could be smooth just 20 feet east. She looked back and saw that the waves continued to rise and roll, smacking against the wall that lined the mayor's yard. The guests, oblivious to the phenomenon, shouted theories at each other, and Heimlich maneuvered belly laughter over the sound of elevator jazz ensemble. Again, she felt the urge to warn them, and again, she couldn't think of what to say. Could anyone else even see the clean line of rising waves? Maybe all this time alone on the boat was warping her mind. As she turned to move along with her boat, she felt the quiet edge of sanity. The elevator music stopped, and she heard the thumping of microphone being tested. There he was, slick, flushed, wide, and smiling. He stood on a little platform with his back to the river. His guests and their champagne flutes all turned toward him. The media elbowed each other half-heartedly, trying to manifest an interesting shot. That's when it happened. First thing was a shudder, just a bit bigger than the quake of summer 2010, which had shut down work on both sides of the river. And then one solitary and massive wave, a sickly bright green whip up out of the blue river, headed toward the mayor's back. Words were coming out of her mouth, incredulous screams twisted with a certain glee. "The island's coming! The river is going to eat all of you carpetbaggers right up!" When she heard what she was saying, she slapped her hand over her mouth, ashamed. But no one even looked in her direction. And if they had, they would have seen naught but a black water woman, alone in a boat. The wave was over the yard just before the guests had noticed it, looking up with grins frozen on their faces. It looked like a trick, an illusion. The mayor laughed at their faces before realizing with an animated double take that there was something behind him. As she watched, the wave crashed over the fence, the covered dock, the mayor, the guests, the press, hitting the house with its full force with a start, a gasp of awe. She saw that the wave was no wider than the house. Nothing else was even wet. The wave receded as fast as it had come. Guests sprawled in all manners of positions, river water dripping down their supine bodies, some tossed through the windows of the house, a few in the pear tree down the yard. Frantically, as humans do after an incident, they started checking themselves and telling the story of what had just happened. Press people lamented over their soaked equipment, guests straightened their business casual attire into wet order, and security detail blew their cover as they desperately looked for the mayor. Some felt the boys on the side of her boat. She felt the boys on the side of her boat gently bump up against the river wall and realized that her jaw had dropped and her hands fallen from the wheel. The water was now utterly calm in every direction. Still shocked, she gunned the engine gently back toward the mansion. The mayor was nowhere to be seen, nor was his wife, and others were missing. She could see the smallness of the remaining guests. All along the fence was party detritus, similar to what was left by the swallowed hipsters. Heeled shoes, pieces of dresses and slacks. On the surface of the water near the mansion, phones and cameras floated. On the podium, the rose from the mayor's lapel lay, looking as if it had just bloomed. The city tried to contain the story, but too many journalists had been knocked about in the wave, felt the strange, all-powerful nature of it, saw the post-tsunami yard full of people like themselves from Detroit. Plus, the mayor was gone. The crazy, impossible story made it to the public, and the public panicked. She watched the island harbor empty out. The island officially closed with cement blockades across the only bridge linking it to the city. The newly sworn-in mayor was a local who had been involved in local gardening work, one of the only people willing to step up into the role. He said this was an opportunity wrapped in a crisis to take the city back. She felt the population of the city diminish as investors and pioneers packed up, looking for fertile new ground. And she noticed who stayed, and it was the same people who had always been there. A little unsure of the future, maybe, but too deeply rooted to move anywhere quickly. For the first time in a long time, she knew just what to say. It never did touch us, you know. Maybe it's a funny way to do it, but maybe it's a good thing we got our city back. And folks listened, shaking their heads as they tried to understand, while their mouths agreed. It ain't how I'd have done it, but the thing is done. She still went out in her boat, looking over the edges near the island, searching inside the river, which was her most constant companion, and for some clue, for some explanation, and every now and then, squinting against the sun's reflection, she'd see through the blue, something swallowed, caught, held down so the city could survive. Something that never died. Something alive. And thus endeth the story. All right, y'all, that was The River, our third and final story for the night. And the book that this story comes from, as well as others, is Octavia's Brood. Let me go ahead and put that up for you one more again so that you can see what it looks like the next time you are perusing and looking for something to read. You might want to pick this little beauty thing up. I have to say, I love this book. I love the premise of this book. Oh, hold up. You can't see it because the camera. I love this book. I love the premise of this book. I love why this book was created. There's no way for me to hold this up and have the overlay. It's fine. I love lamp. I love this book. There we go. I love the premise behind this book. I love why it was created, and I love the stories that we've read so far. It's been really exciting. I know we're running a little bit late, so I'm just going to read a few of the comments here. Latricia pulled out a good line: something big and swallowed. I like that. I like how that led into that description of the 1964 car. That gardening in their backyard was not a hobby, but a strategy. How did I know that if nobody else got that line, Angel Monique was going to pull that line out? And then it looks like Latricia pulled that one out too. Clear as a moonbeam on a midnight sea. That was a lovely line too. This story actually had a lot of really rich language in it, and a lot of little sly winks and nods that I truly appreciated. Angela Lee Raines pulled out The River, which was her most constant companion. Really, really good stuff here. Thank you all so much for coming and spending this extended period of time with me. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with me, and that means a lot. Please follow and share our pages and share your experiences with a friend, because we need reviews. All right. So if you liked what you heard tonight, or if you liked what you've heard any of the nights that you've been here on Storytime with Julian, why don't you go to our page on Facebook and leave us a review? 5 stars, please. Please, 5 stars. I mean, it just seems like the polite thing to do. But let folk know and post about us in your social media. And you know what? If you follow us, we'll follow back. We're a big fan of that. So you can find us as @StorytimeJulian on the Twitters. We're @StorytimeJulian on Instagram, on YouTube, of course. And some of you are watching on YouTube. All you got to do is just type in the share story to type in the search bar, youtube.com/Storytime with Julian. And if you ever want to hear any of the random things that I'm up to and ranting about, you can find me @Magnet4Awesome. That's who I am on the Twitters. And if you want to see me on the Instagram, occasionally I take a pretty picture and post it up. That is Julian Shot First. Thank you you so much for coming out tonight. Again, if you would please, I want to remind you, donate to the Storytime with Julian Spring book drive. We are so close to our goal, and I'm so thrilled that we are, and I can't wait to see all the kids with the books in their hands. What else do I want to tell you? Also, if you can, if you haven't had the chance yet, please tip your griot if you can. It helps us to continue this show and keep on keeping on with what we're doing. We're always going to do it for as often as we can, but your help and your support in every way, whether it's financial or just through spreading the word and just being here tonight and commenting, like, it means the world to me, y'all. For real, for real. If you enjoy that music that you hear at the beginning, that is by Arbatu. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, because Angel ain't going to let it not be said. That's her baby. That's her baby made that music. And we're going to make sure that we're going to bless him with something too, because that is good, good stuff. Hopefully sometime soon, you'll be able to download some more of his creations. I'm going to be trying to work with him soon to see if we can get a Storytime with Julian playlist going. So be on the lookout for that. But anyhow, this has been episode 87, Dark and Brooding. I hope you liked it. I hope you're into this book. I hope you go pick it up and pick it out. And thank you, Miss Ebony Martin and Gwen, even though you being a smart butt. Thank you. I hope you do. And I don't know why this song is on there, but Kiss Me and I'll Kiss You Back is one of my joints. And that's it. Judy Lee says thank you for reading to us tonight. And the mod team says thanks for sharing Octavia's Brood this evening with us. I appreciate all of you. Go ahead and stay tuned for the credits. We're going to go ahead and call this a close. This has been episode 87. You have been wonderful. Thanks for coming out, y'all. Peace.